Hello and welcome to the Magical Midlife podcast, where you get a refreshing, uplifting and optimistic perspective on life in your 40s and 50s. I'm your host, Lindsay de Swart, and I'm delighted that you've joined us here today, so let's jump right in. Hello, this is Lindsay de Swart and welcome to Magical Midlife. And today it's going to be a very exciting day because I am interviewing my dear friend Jo McRogers. And Jo is a grief social worker. And she has one of those jobs that you kind of think, who has that job? Because it's so valuable, but nobody likes to talk about it. So welcome, Jo.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'm honored to be interviewed.
Oh, thank you. And I'm just really intrigued, actually, about your journey to be doing what you do. And then if you could share some insight about what it is you do. And also, I know you've got some lovely perspectives on the magical midlife. So let's dig into that too. So can I ask you, first of all, just give us an introduction about who you are, and then we've got plenty of directions to go from there.
Sure, certainly. Yes. A social worker by trade. I worked for many other people in hovels and hostels and street work and shift work in emergency crisis departments in the hospitals and mobile and telephone crisis teams for a long, long time. And then as my life moved on and I had my children, I realized after my third was born that I needed to give up the 24/7 rotation shift work pager stuff. So at that point, that's when I launched into my private practice. So what you know about me in terms of the other work I've done is that I'm good in the moment. I'm a bit of an emotional adrenaline junkie from doing all the crisis work. It really inspired me. So then I went into my private practice, and because of who I knew in the community, I often was receiving referrals for women around a transition in life in terms of stepping into motherhood, stepping into pregnancy, stepping into fertility challenges and struggles. So I did that for many, many years, supporting women around stepping into motherhood or wishing to step into motherhood. And then we would do the therapy, women who had had traumatic birthing experiences as well. Not necessarily a loss per se in terms of the grief that I'm now doing, but trauma that they needed to process. And so I would do the social work with them and the therapy with them, and then they would go off to do their birthing and they would hire a doula. And I honestly just got a little jealous and thought, well, wait a minute, like I'm going to expand my spectrum of services. So I went and did my doula training. So then I would be able to be with women through supporting them with their challenges and then be at the birth with them as well. And it was lovely, wonderful work. And I am so thankful for every woman and family that chose me to be at their birth. What I came to recognize was that there are so many defining moments in that phase of a woman's life. Mm-hmm. So you do birth work long enough, you're going to intersect with loss as well. Yeah, and so I came to realize at that point, nobody was doing that type of work in any kind of supported, focused way. So I knew that if moments in birthing are defining moments in a person's life, so that equal and opposite, it must be true as well in loss. Mm-hmm. So I then went back and did my stillbirth doula training so that I could support women in loss in a very focused, accepting, loving, supporting, verbal way, because it's loss of pregnancy, early infant loss. I call it when the unthinkable becomes the unspeakable. And women really didn't have a place to be able to process that and be with their grief. And so that was many years ago that I launched that. And since that time, people have called also to say, well, it wasn't a pregnancy, it wasn't an infant, it was my sibling, or it was my husband, or it was a very good friend of mine that has passed, and I don't know what to do with this grief. So my grief practice just naturally took on and very organically grew to be losses of so many different kinds. And when you say it's the job nobody wants, we are quirky, those of us who work in the deathing world. There's no doubt we are quirky people.
The deathing world, yeah.
We're very quirky, but what sustains me, and this is going to sound so corny, but what sustains me is that at the end of my clinic days, what I've been talking about all day long is love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that keeps me grounded in doing the work that I'm doing. And through that work, I've developed, some of my own principles and philosophies about how to process, how to be with your grief as opposed to just in your grief, and giving people opportunities to explore it. Grief is one of those things that's not meant to be pathologized. It's not meant to be fixed. It's not meant to, you're not meant to just get over it. It's my job is to find a place for people to be with it.
Yes, absolutely.
Those are my guiding principles in doing grief work.
Mm-hmm. I think, and it's something that you touched on already, it's just, as you say, when things become the unspeakable. Because if you don't know how to talk about it and you can't verbalize it without, crumbling into tears, you don't talk about it. And yet it's something that all of us will experience at some stage.
Yeah.
And to not be able to voice it, to not be able to express yourself is surely dragging it out even longer than it needs to and giving it a whole different wrapper of taboo negativity when it's something that we all go through.
Yes, you're right. Sadly, it is the one thing that we all have in common. We will all grieve at some point.
Yeah.
And it's the one thing that we all don't want to have in common.
Yeah.
Yeah. Grief itself can be very isolating, you're right, because we don't have a lived history with it, or if we do have a lived history with it, it's a very shushing blueprint, or don't go there, or just, you got to be strong. All of those well-intentioned but not so helpful sayings that I know I've said in the past before I really researched and studied and experienced my own grief experiences as well, that it isolates you in that, like the meta message in that, of course, is then, so don't talk about it because you're different now.
Yeah. And people don't know what to say.
Yes. And really, it's the one thing we're all going to share at some point. It is like, it doesn't discriminate in race or color or culture or economic or health status or anything like that. It's the one thing that we will all share at one point in our lives. So we need to break out that isolation. And that's, I really believe that we need to approach grief differently and creatively. And some people are talkers, so therapy is right for them. Some aren't, so journaling is right for them. Others are creative people in their heart and soul, so they need to explore their grief that way as well. So it's my work, I'm calling it a Grievolution. We need to do this differently.
Yeah, so right. And especially after a pandemic, let's face it.
Yes, the pandemic has not been kind to grief. It's so many people in my practice tell me that they feel like their grief has been eclipsed because, for many reasons, because their small experience, personal experience, doesn't seem nearly as big as the world experience. We are not able to hold funerals or rituals or ceremonies that promote our grieving the way that we are familiar with. So it feels like, I'm just going to put this on hold. So many people have talked about when this is over, we'll hold the memorial service then. And that's so tricky because grief needs to be witnessed in real time. And other people have said, well, like everybody's hurting right now. So I don't want to lean on my friends. I really don't want to ask for support because everybody's hurting right now. And so people's grief experiences have really been challenged and changed over the last 15 months now. People have died differently. People are mourning differently. It's a bit of a mess. And I think that when and however this comes to a different place with the pandemic, there's going to be a lot of relationship repair. There's going to be a lot of processing that's going to need to go on. And the grief is just going to linger and it's going to be there waiting for us.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, this is a different perspective, and I don't know if it's something that you've come across or heard of too, but I'd be interested in your perspective on it. There is the energetic belief that actually the energy of grief is held within the lungs. And one of the things with COVID, of course, is it does affect the lungs, and therefore it's a world crisis of grieving because grief is shushed and brushed under the carpet and dealt with in silence and pain. Have you heard anything along those perspectives?
Certainly, yes. And the people that I support that are interested in those kinds of perspectives, I'm sharing and exploring with them. And even those who aren't necessarily wanting to process their grief on a spiritual level, I still talk about the breath and the science based behind it. And that's another one of those analogies between birthing and deathing, is that we arrive on this earth with our first intake of breath, and then we leave the earth with our last exhale.
Yeah.
And so we all need to be cognizant of what we put in the middle of those two.
Yes.
So I'm always talking about the breath, Lindsay. You're absolutely right. And it, particularly for people when we're talking about shocking sudden deaths, which sometimes is what's happening with COVID, is you hear shocking news, and it's a short, sharp intake of breath. And then when people aren't able to do their grieving or their grief work, then they often get stuck holding themselves.
I was going to say, they can't breathe out.
Yeah. For 15 months now, there's been many people that have not taken a full breath.
Yeah. I mean, I know how people just operate in stress, how shallow their breath becomes. And that's just everyday stress that, we all used to live in. And now we're in a different level of everyday stress. But so, yeah, it was so interesting what you say about the breath. Okay, so let's just rewind a little bit, because I want to know more about Jo. And you say that you've got 3 kids.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's funny because we actually met on the side of the rugby pitch, didn't we?
Rugby pitch, yes, years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So have you always lived around here, been in this area? Have you traveled? Tell me a little bit about your background, have made you who you've become to be who you are today.
Okay. Grew up in small town Niagara, Ontario, in St. Catharines. Left to go to university at McMaster. Had, stars in my eyes, couldn't wait to get to Toronto. Graduated from my BA BSW, went to Toronto. Apparently that wasn't quite good enough for me. So I did also, I call it my running away. I ran away to live in Greenwich Village and do my master's in New York.
Cool.
So that was my big, yes, that was like shooting for the stars kind of Jo. So I did that, came back to live in Toronto, and was so fortunate to have family and friends that supported me on those voyages. And it put a bit of a travel bug in my system. And then I met my husband, John, who also has a very big travel bug in his system. So the other things that we've done as a family was, when the kids were quite little, we closed down our lives in Ontario and moved out to live on Vancouver Island for a year as a big experiment. And then we came back to our Ontario lives. And then many years later, we closed down our lives here and went and lived in New Zealand for a year also.
I remember that.
Yeah. So I suspect my children also have travel bugs in their veins also.
Fantastic. So what did you gain by those experiences? I'd forgotten about New Zealand entirely. So that's such a brave thing to do. So whole new chapter, let's go. So what did you learn because that's stressful, packing up your whole life and then just going off to another country for a year. Tell me about that.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about women's milestones and life milestones. When we took the kids and lived on Vancouver Island, they were quite little, and we were still their hub, right? So that was relatively easy to do because they were barely old enough. They weren't having sleepovers. Their gang was not their reference point quite yet. And so we were, and so we took that show on the road, and that was lovely and fun and playful. When we did New Zealand, they were older. My eldest was having her sweet 16 in New Zealand. And so that's a whole different stage of life. And unfortunately, we moved to New Zealand just after that awful earthquake in Christchurch.
Right.
So in terms of me, I wasn't fearful of doing it, but I will say that in terms of the magical midlife, I took my family to a small nation that was having a crisis when I was pre-menstrual and perimenopausal. And that was probably not the best time for me to do it. Because we moved to New Zealand and we no longer had jobs because buildings had fallen down. We no longer had addresses because the house we were going to be living in had fallen off the cliff in this horrific earthquake. And so we we didn't have a fixed address. I could not even get a video rental card to entertain my kids while we tried to figure all this stuff out while we were in New Zealand, because I didn't have a fixed address. It's like, oh, that's pretty low when you can't get a video rental card. Yeah. We couldn't get a cell phone because we didn't have a fixed address. So that trip in particular, and the kids were that much older, I say there was incredible adventure and adversity in that, and I'm still harvesting all the wisdom from that.
I was going to say that must have made, well, it's also, I mean, how did that affect the kids? Because what a great learning experience, even if it wasn't fun at the time.
Right. I think I would hazard a guess that they would tell you that in the long run, it was wonderful. Mm-hmm. But they learned even from like the early ages going to Vancouver Island of the fact that you can leave and make new friends and make new connections and have a new life. And you can come back and you haven't necessarily missed anything.
Yes.
So I think it's opened their thoughts, as I say, not just to travel bug, but to the fact that that they can have new adventures without losing the old ones.
Oh, that's a nice way of putting it. Love that.
The eldest at that time, she's in high school and it's a tough time, right? Leaving all of your friends and your reference points. And I didn't say it as we left, but I did ask when we came back in terms of, so do you think it's true that you could go away for a year and come back and just carry on, that you didn't miss any monumental events? And it was like, yeah, that's true. It's like, okay, job well done. We've done it. We got them back safe and sound with all of those kinds of realizations. And actually that's where the love of rugby came in our family too, was all of them played rugby in New Zealand. And then that led me to the pitch where I met you when your kids were playing rugby.
Yay, thanks New Zealand.
Yes, I have so many thanks to New Zealand, the community, the culture. They saved our butts so many times.
Seriously.
It's yeah, we were sleeping on couches, the generosity. Well, my in-laws are away, you can have their house for a week. Our water tank kept running out. Neighbors put garden hoses from their water tank to our house so we could wash our dishes or go up the street to have showers. Incredible. Yes. If you ever get the chance, go see New Zealand and just revel in the culture, because the people and the place itself is just beautiful. Wow. And those are the kinds of defining moments in terms of when you say like, wasn't that scary? Yeah, but such great lessons and such great experiences. And when you do things like that, then you carry that energy into other challenges.
You do, absolutely.
Yeah.
So before we get too far in, I would love to ask, especially because you just talked about a brave challenge that you went through by choice, but it also became an adventure. So Jo, tell me how you really feel about the magical midlife.
I have a succinct moment. Actually, I will tell you this story. So I have to tell you also, you talk about people being in their 40s and their 50s. You got to start including us in our 60s, hey? Because I had my 60th this year.
Yay, congratulations.
Thank you. And I don't know whether I think I might have been 50 at the time, but somebody referred to me as middle-aged. Mm-hmm. And I was gutted. That had never happened to me before. I was gutted. And I called up a girlfriend who happened to be quite a bit younger. I should have taken that into context, but I called her up and said, can you believe it? Somebody called me middle-aged. And she said, well, yeah, how long do you think you're really going to live?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Are you still in touch with that friend?
Kind of, sort of. But I did think like, that's not the support I was looking for, but there was some reality to that. And so that was my first gut punch with middle-aged. So I knew it was very uncomfortable. We're in a society that worships youth.
Yes.
We are not one of the societies here in North America that reveres its elders. There are many cultures that reveres the elders and the wisdom that they carry and the reverence for their lived experience, but not so much in north of Toronto culture. So I was incredibly put off by that term, and I had to do a lot of work with it because I knew I was going there anyways, right? We don't stop the clock. So I have coined my own term because I was doing so much work in the childbearing years, right? In terms of the birthing and the doula work. So I have coined my own term, which feels so much more regal. So I have left my childbearing years and I have now entered my wisdom bearing years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Feels so different to say it that way.
It really does. Okay, if you're getting t-shirts printed,
there's a good idea.
Because it really is. You bring with you, by living however many years, 40, 50, 60 years, you've learned so much, you've experienced so much. So to have that kind of washed away with, your old, your midlife, your middle age, whatever you want to call it, that's so wasteful to me. Otherwise, we'll just keep making the same mistakes. If nobody learns from anybody else's past, and I know we all have to make our own mistakes, but if nobody learns anything, how is that evolution? I don't get it.
Right. Yes, I agree completely. And the communities and the cultures that do hold their elders in high esteem benefit from that. Whereas, I could talk another whole podcast with you, Lindsay, about how that came to be in terms of elders used to be cared in the home, and then now they're put away in homes. And so it's like isolate their wisdom. It's not valued. And so here we are, a culture, and now in the pandemic, we've seen the long-term care home crisis that has happened.
Absolute crisis.
I can't help but think if we had valued their wisdom, they wouldn't have been there like that. So, true. I do hope that there's some other evolutions happening other than my Grievolution around valuing men and women. And men seem to age more gracefully, and they become the wise sages, and women become hags. And we have to really, really challenge a lot of that as well.
I know the sort of the labels, the hag, the crone, none of them have a positive connotation. And yet in other cultures, and as you say, and times gone by, they were the healers.
Yes.
Yes, we bring new life to the world, but that was so much about the quality of life. And that seems to have been filtered out, whether it's by marketing or patriarch, whatever you want to blame it on. It doesn't really matter. As you say, there's something that we have to completely re-energize the good that's involved in that.
Yes, I agree. And the other thing that happens too, I think, is that we need to know that loss cannot be replaced. I mean, in the grief work that I do, so many times I sit with people and say, oh, I wish I had asked my grandmother this question. I wish I had got her to, dictate that recipe to me. I wish she had told me the stories of her childhood. And so it shows up in the grief work that I do all the time in terms of lost opportunities.
Yeah.
We need to start asking the right questions. People need to feel that their stories are valued.
Well, and giving them time. Because I know my mum will be listening to this, but I know I have a hell of a time sometimes when my kids want a faux granny or grandma, they will, but it's not a regular thing. And I'm just like, no, really? She's probably done that. One of your grandmothers has probably done that. You should just ring and ask. But it's well, maybe not now, or a bit later. Everything is delayed, pushed off. Yeah. And yet,
that's one of the problems. That's one of the problems, Lindsay, with grief. We all think we have more time.
Yeah, it's so true.
To do anything and everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the other thing that I think gets complicated, and this is, you'd mentioned how I've got some philosophies around midlife too. I think the other thing that happens for women is that our hormones change, and we have done all of those childbearing, child tending years. And women are often sort of the intuitive anticipators of needs and meeting needs. But when we hit that midlife, the menopausal years, and our hormones change, some of that gentles and softens so that we can actually start asking ourselves like, hey, my childbearing bearing and tending years have changed. So now I can actually start tending to myself. And the problem is, again, in our society, looking after yourself is sometimes seen as being selfish.
Absolutely.
And man, when you start energetically changing, those around you may not welcome that, may not want that. So there's a bit of pushback as well, because it just doesn't fit with how they know who you are to be.
Exactly. Because the expectation has been set up over many years.
Yes.
Whilst kids have needed more attention, or whilst you're trying to build your career. And then, as you say, when you move into a different time and you soften, I love how you've said that, that you soften, and therefore you can tune more into your intuition, your own guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is also an element of you have to defend yourself in order to do that.
And it's another one of those brave choices, like traveling or moving with your family, in terms of, so what's your blueprint about? This is where it comes full circle, Lindsay, in my therapy practice, in terms of this now shows up your blueprint about how do you affect change? Is change scary? Are you ready? How do you make change happen? Do you slam into it? Do you toes into it? What's your blueprint about communication? What's your blueprint about self-care and self-esteem and it's like another mini adolescence, but with wisdom. At whatever age that, menopause happens and people start stepping into, it's like a bit of a recreation into, so who am I now? Some people go, wow, who am I now? And other people go, oh my heavens, who am I now? Like, it's just, your blueprint keeps showing up.
Yeah.
That's your developmental milestone when you're in this magical midlife.
Absolutely. I think for some people, just depending on, what age you have your children, how many children you have, or whatever, invariably, or not invariably, sometimes you're in a household whereby there are kids going through their teenage years, i.e. they're coming into their adult years. So that's a whole ball game of its own. And then you've potentially got parents in midlife. And then, so obviously I can only speak from my perspective as a woman, but then if you've got hormonal changes going on and you've got this struggle to find who you are, and the kids have got the struggle to find who they are, that potentially could be an absolute madhouse.
I can tell you it was.
Yes. And if I hadn't have done so much work on myself right now, we may well be in that situation too.
Yeah. Well, I met my husband when I was 28. We didn't start having kids till I was 35. And I did warn him. I don't know where I got this wisdom from early on. It wasn't earned. It was foresight, maybe. I did warn him, saying, so, we're going to do adolescence and menopause at the same time, right? So you might just want to pack up the tent, and I'll tell you when it's safe to come home.
Yeah, you might want to take another trip to New Zealand, see if they need you.
Go save yourself, and we'll be here sorting it all out.
Although saying that, your husband's surrounded by teenagers with his work anyway, isn't he?
Yes, as a high school teacher.
So he must have known what he was in for.
Yes, but not with a menopausal wife at the same time.
Fair point. Yes. Okay.
Who could predict, right? And women's experiences of that can be so individual and so personal. And again, there your blueprint shows up in terms of, are you someone that knows to seek help? Are you someone who suffers quietly? Are you someone who takes everybody down with you? Are you somebody who plays the martyr? Like all of that stuff, it's like the adolescent acne, the menopausal acne comes back. It's all on our face. It's all on our heart. It's all on our sleeve. It just keeps showing up. So it is a very dynamic time in terms of magical midlife. I've loved how you've coined that term. It's like my flip of the words around wisdom bearing years. It's a magical midlife. It can be. You have to pay your dues, but you can do that softly and with help and with self-compassion, or you can push your way through it.
Well, that's the thing. It is like an awakening. And let's face it, no birth is particularly pretty. So if this is a rebirth, why would that be necessarily pretty? It can be fantastic what comes out at the end of it, just like the birth of a baby.
Yeah.
However, there's some adjustments to be made.
There are labor pains, and there are no epidurals for menopause.
Absolutely.
Yes. So it is a time that really needs to be spoken about again. And it is a time of grief because you are letting go of who you were, who at some level, even if you didn't like who you were, you did it. It was comfortable. It was familiar. It was your reference points. And now you're moving into a whole new place. And so there is some grief. Naturally, change involves grief. So letting go of who you were and where you were at in order to make room for, oh my goodness, who can I grow into now?
Absolutely. And so what's your view on the whole social expectations of who you need to be? Because that tends to be shared with midlife too, I find, if you're in a magical midlife.
Well, it's, again, we need another whole hour to talk about that. But I think social expectations are large around, all of the media and magazines, not so much anymore because a lot of people aren't doing print, but it's all youth and smooth skin and 20-something, figures and shapes. And it's not kind to a magical midlife necessarily around those expectations. And then if you look different, sometimes you think you feel different. And then again, that leads to isolation. And again, that's why I'm so thrilled that you're doing this in terms of women need to talk about this. I have found that I'm probably closer with a lot of my women friends now than I was in those early child tending years, because that was the focus, tending on the kids. We'd look after each other's kids. We talk about the kids, but no, now we can get together. And I have one very good friend that sends me Snapchats of pretending like she's plucking chin hairs and we can talk about those kinds of things with humor and acceptance for each other, whereas there's a lot of shame that can go on with midlife changes.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you could tune into your wisdom and advise somebody who is at the beginning of this journey or whose blueprint has not been a very positive one, what insights and wisdom would you give them?
Reach out, seek help, seek some wise guides who will give you input, whether it be a homeopath or a naturopath or a physician, around how to support you physically. Reach out to people who you feel energized by being around. Reach out to therapy so you can have someone to process the changes with and talk about, what does this mean for me now, and how is my life changing, and how is my blueprint showing up? And know that we do get through it, but I don't want to do that toxic positivity. As I say, you can go into it with support and self-compassion and reverence, or you can drag your feet through it and get to the other side and be what some of those awful stereotypes about the crone and the hag are, because that's probably how you're going to feel. So know that this is a transition. It's a normal, natural transition. Again, it doesn't need to be fixed. It doesn't need to be pathologized. It needs to be supported, seen, and accepted.
I think the other thing that people don't talk about, and maybe that's because of statistics, I don't know, but also as you come into midlife, it challenges your relationship. Because if you're changing as a person, your wants are different, your needs are different, and potentially if you're growing into who you are, then you're going to project yourself differently in the world. Now, a partner might struggle to face that. So, is that something that you face in your practice or with the work that you've done over the years?
Yes, but it doesn't stand out as different transitions to me, because I see that, again, the same transition of women stepping into motherhood. That's a change in your relationship. Women stepping into the empty nest syndrome. That's a change in your relationship. Women stepping into retirement years. That's a change in your relationship. Women stepping into menopausal years, magical midlife years. That's a change. And I think just largely we're scared of transitions when these are our developmental milestones, and we need to do our research. We need to make grounded decisions. I would say to women all the time, I can get behind whatever you want to set as a goal if you can tell me that it's a decision, as opposed to a reaction being made out of fear.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the two feel completely different and the results are completely different.
Yes. Yes. So if you want to go and have a breast lift and a tummy tuck, tell me why. Because if it's out of fear, then you're going to look great, but that fear is just going to find another place to manifest. Mm-hmm. If it's out of the fact that you want to be more physical, or that you know that it's something that you know is going to help your self-esteem and help you move forward with other decisions, then that's easier to back. Mm-hmm. But if it's out of fear of not being accepted, not being loved, not being sensual, sexual, then we got to look at that, because that is a never-ending journey.
Yeah, that's like a bottomless pit, isn't it? That you'll just never fill that.
Yes, I'm afraid that the Botox industry is just capitalized on that. The cosmetic industry is largely, now I know they do incredible reconstruction work, and I'm not suggesting that they don't, but I do know that the industry, some of the industry is so largely fear-driven about acceptance, about appearance, about it's the medical version of, do you get enough likes on your Instagram?
Yeah, it's exactly that. Yeah, I mean, certainly I know people who are in the public eye, and they say the pressure on them to not be midlife is ridiculous. I mean, what are they going to do? Step in a time machine? You don't have an alternative.
Yeah.
And it will be interesting to see when society will step into the reality of, actually, if you do make it to midlife and that you're healthy and, you know, living your best life in your midlife, that, quite frankly, is a privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So when would you have the gratitude for being where you are, having lived the life you've lived, you know, good and bad experiences, but walking that path is a privilege.
Yeah. Yes. You're right. In my grief work, lots of people don't make it to midlife.
Exactly. That's, yeah. So
and they use the word gratitude. I think that's something, I mean, I'm always preaching gratitude, and it's not because the people that I get to sit with aren't gracious people. I preach gratitude all the time, because gratitude is like the antidote to anxiety lots of times, because anxiety is largely based in living with past thoughts about the past or predicting crises in the future. If you're having a moment of gratitude, it's a moment that's practicing being present.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I preach gratitude a lot. And I think that that's really important. Even women who are going through their magical midlife changes, and it would be a lovely practice to have, in terms of, even though I'm all over the place, or even though I can't stand these hot flashes, I'm thankful that I'm getting to live long enough to experience these. And I am going to, dedicate myself to harvesting the wisdom out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the freedom, actually,
that
goes with it. If you are a mom, you don't have the kids hanging off you anymore. You're not needed for everything. I mean, I'm loving the fact now that I can go off for a few hours and sort of text at home and say, is supper made? I'm coming home now. And on a good night, somebody says, yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying that happens every night, but on a good night, it can happen. Whereas with the little kids, I didn't have that freedom to go and do that.
No. Although I knew that I was preparing this morning, again, and getting a mindset for some of the questions you might ask, or our interview time. I have to say, I will never reveal who it was in the house that sent me a text saying, hello, I need toilet paper. And I'm laughing, thinking, here I am talking about the magical midlife, and yet someone in my house still needs toilet paper. It was kind of a sweet moment, actually, in terms of, okay, they do still need me, even on some of those instrumental little things.
Fair enough. And I bet they're all old enough to drive, aren't they?
Oh, completely. Completely. It was just one of those moments.
Yes. Those special moments.
The irony of it was that I had put the extra roll on the back of the toilet yesterday. So it is a mixed phase also, right? In terms of not being needed nearly as much. Then you have these little spikes. And with the pandemic that's going on, I mean, we know that the young adults are suffering immensely. So that's ratcheted up those of us that have older kids to really pay attention and be vigilant about how to support them, because they are experiencing incredible grief. Their grief will be different than our grief right now. And it's really important to stay connected with your kids, even if it's just handing them a roll of toilet paper when they could drive and get their own. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting that you say about, they're experiencing a different grief. at the end, I mean, there are so many experiences that they are not able to go through, that we just completely took for granted about growing up and becoming more independent and choosing a career. All of those have been shaped differently now because they're kind of losing that element of choice, or they're being forced into a corner to make a different choice. So, I mean, how are they dealing with that? Do you know?
Well, if you read the stats in terms of the calls to the kids helpline have, threefold increase. The crisis in the opiate world of the overdoses is like they've never seen before in terms of numbers. Eating disorders are through the roof. Kids are showing up at the hospital in way, way worse shape with their eating disorder than prior, because again, there's not as many watchful eyes. People aren't as willing to go for help. People are avoiding hospitals, which includes a lot of mental health services. So it's showing up. And I think that them and the young ones are going to be generations to be studied around what this comes from. And I hate even thinking that our kids are cohorts and studies because of what they've lived through these last 15 months. There was a great article, I don't know if you saw it, I'll forward it to you, in the New York Times, that talked about languishing.
Oh, yes, I did see it.
Yes. And what they talk about is that the people that they don't necessarily have a mental health diagnosis at this point, but that this gray area of languishing, because it's affecting so many people who in their lifetime have either never experienced anxiety or depression and never thought they weren't predisposed, felt resourced, felt grounded, felt resilient, are experiencing this place called languishing. Those of us that are falling into that category of languishing post-pandemic are going to be the place that maybe has the most need for the most help, because they haven't had experience with it before. They haven't had resilience. They haven't asked for help, and they're not getting caught up in any kind of spot checks.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
Yes.
So on a very practical and real note, would you be happy to share any guidelines about how you work with people who are going through grief, what you may advise them to do, just almost like the ABCs? Because as I say, it's something, especially if people aren't willing to reach out for help or they're in a situation where they can't, if you're happy to share that with us.
Oh, of course, yes. Well, I think the work that I've done this long has taught me that being a griever is an awful place to be. And what happens is that people get stuck in being the griever. And what I've come to realize clinically, my job is to help them be with their grief instead of solely in their grief.
Okay. So how does that look different?
So it looks different in terms of having a relationship with their grief. It looks different, again, looking at blueprints about what did you learn as a child about grief? What are your communication styles? How likely are you to ask for help? How can we put all that together and learn your strengths so that we can then know how you can design your response to your grief? And then it just gives them a bit of an arm's length distance to experiencing their grief, because our society tells us you feel like crap for 3 months and then you get over it. People will look for things like, oh, they're back to work, or, oh, they're talking about having another baby, or, oh, he's started dating now, so he must be over it. None of those things. No, exactly. And none of those things are realistic measurements. So people are anxious to say, oh, they're okay. So what I'm helping people do is really establish a relationship with their grief, and how are they going to navigate it? What are their particular blueprints and therefore tools to navigate it? Are they somebody who needs to talk about it again? Are they someone who writes about it? Are they someone who visits the cemetery or not? Are they someone who establishes a charitable organization? All of those places are sort of their grief in movement. And I think that's just so important that we as a society don't foster that for people. A lot of the people that I meet with will say, I wish there was like a town that you could go to where everyone was grieving, and everybody would know to just be kind to each other.
Yeah, fair enough.
Because grief needs to be seen, and it just needs to be supported. And you need to know that it also challenges relationships of friends. Lots of people will say, yeah, my address book changed completely. My contact list changed completely. People showed up for me who I didn't have a close relationship with, and people who I thought would be there for me through thick and thin said all the wrong things and just disappeared.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Unfortunately, the people who are grieving are often the ones that are teaching their contacts, their close ones, about how to help them, which is just such a burden on the griever. But until we talk about this more and more, and until we talk about this, like even to back it up before someone dies, until we can start talking about what a good death might look like, then we're really handicapped in trying to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny the detail people go into to create the perfect birth plan.
Yeah.
But at the other end of the spectrum, or the other end of life, people don't spend time doing that.
No, it's scary and it's challenging and it's hard. But in my industry, we talk about things to tell families, like, leave your loved ones memories. Don't leave them decisions. Yes.
Okay.
Because the person on the other side then feels honor bound to get it right. What would they have wanted? Would they have wanted organ donations? Would they have wanted a ceremony? Would they have wanted open casket? Would they have wanted cremation? Like, if you don't know those things, then you're guessing, and that guessing space is just room for guilt. It's like a guilt vacuum, because grieving and guilt are evil twins. They go together.
Now, you saying that, I have heard that there are 5 stages of grieving. Do you believe that's true?
That's a common belief. The woman who wrote the book, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, even has, she's passed a number of years ago, but she came to be really clear about the fact that those 5 stages of grief are meant for someone who's been given sort of a terminal diagnosis. It's not for someone who is grieving someone else who passed.
Oh, you're right then. That is a common misconception.
Yes, it's a big misconception. Now, I will say that everything that she listed is probably part of all grief, but in those stages, and she did say that they're also not linear. Certainly those exist when you're grieving, but I have I don't know whether it's humbly or very cockily designed my own my own belief around grief. And
would you be happy to share that with us? Or is it trade secret?
No, certainly. No, happy to share it. I think that what happens is that at the beginning, it's a very busy time of either caring for or caring after someone has passed. You have to cancel credit cards and passports and make arrangements and funerals, and then tell people about the death, and it's a very busy time. So that period of time, and there's no number to it, but that period of time is a very busy time, and what you're doing there is you're having a relationship with the death. And where we make our mistake is that we think that that's our grief. Because what I believe happens then is, after you do all the to-do lists, and you can kind of go check, I'm taking care of this. So there's a sense of accomplishment. And again, as I say, we think that's us doing our grief. What happens then is it's a quieter time, and it always catches people off guard, because then what they're doing is having a relationship with the loss. And that's another whole dragon to slay, because it's not just the loss, it's about the loss of who you were because of them as well. So it's like Magical Midlife, it's like reinvention. It's so now it's like, oh my goodness, this is real. How do I do this? How do I live now? How do I love now? How do I be now? And we forget that that's even a harder stage of grief than the first one, because the first one gives us all kinds of to-dos.
Yeah.
So we have the relationship with the death, we have the relationship with the loss, and then my vision to help people get to is the third stage, which is the honoring.
Okay, and so what does that involve?
The honoring is about how do they honor the person that they loved and lost, the person who died, and what that meant in their life, and how do they honor themselves in terms of who they are now, having incorporated that loss.
Okay. And of course, there's, as you say, it's not linear.
No, you can slide back and forth. Some people do multiple steps at the same time. Some people are asking the questions while they're honoring it. Yes. But I think it's really, the reason I developed that in terms of, it puts little codicils around Okay, so this might be what your energy is at now. This is a death related relationship task or feeling that you're having. This is a loss related relationship feeling that you're having now. Oh, and look, this is how you can address that, because the honorings are what allow us to move forward with our grief. So you don't want it in front of it. You don't want it. This, I always say this one, you don't want it in front of you. So it becomes the first filter that you live through all the time. For a time, it needs to be that way. It's going to demand all of your attention. It's going to be your first filter, but you don't want it to stay there. You don't want to shove it down and repress it and just stiff upper lip and get on with it and put it to behind you. Pretend that it's, because it's eventually going to trip you up.
I was going to say, it will keep creeping up on you if that's the case.
Yes. What you want to think about it is finding a way to put it beside you. It's like it's in the passenger seat so that you integrate it and it comes along with you. It is part of who you are, but it is not the singularly defining filter of who you are.
Right. Okay.
That's a grief done well.
Yeah. And that's a possible thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Absolutely.
So how can people find you, Jo?
I'm not so good at the social media, but my stale, outdated website, about to be renewed, is just my name, jomcrogers.com. But what I'm really excited about, Lindsay, thanks for the opportunity to mention this, is that very soon, in a number of weeks, I'll be launching a YouTube channel. The young ones in my family said, well, you know, Mom, there's this thing called the World Wide Web.
Good, thank you.
Yes, and that you could probably put some of this knowledge and wisdom on YouTube. Very soon, I'll be launching a YouTube channel called Jo McRogers, Grief Support That Works.
Fantastic. Okay.
Yeah, and so that will be available for people to, and again, exploring all kinds of loss and all kinds of, there'll be science, there'll be spirituality, there'll be therapeutic techniques, lots of research. We'll talk about literature, all of those kinds of things in terms of the videos. And then I'm putting together, because I have discerned that individual work is really important, but there's so much that I can lift out of the individual work just in terms of universal knowledge and universal challenges. I'm going to put together some courses that will save people a number of therapy sessions, and they'll be able to take the courses and work through it on their own as well if they don't, because talking isn't right for everybody. It's all in the works. I am doing, individual therapy sessions online through video during the pandemic times. So that certainly is available. And give me a few more weeks and it will be up and running.
Fantastic. Okay, so people can access you through your website.
Yes.
Please reach out to Jo. I've always described Jo as an earth angel.
Oh, you're very sweet.
And I have recommended you to a number of people who I know have grieved family members, because the way you talk with people and the way you handle the whole subject is so compassionate and yet so constructive and helpful. I just think such a fantastic support for people.
Thank you. I thank you for your trust in that, because it's not easy to talk to a stranger about some of your most intimate grief moments. So I value that. I value your opinion. Thank you.
Because I think it's been so very helpful, but so very needed. Nobody wants to talk about death. And as I say, it's so valuable. So I really appreciate you spending your time with us today. Thank you so much. And I've also dispelled the myth of the 5 stages of grieving, which I'm really pleased about, because I'm absolutely one of those people that potentially I wouldn't know what to say.
Right. Oh, there'll be videos coming on that, because there's another whole hour in terms of good intentions gone awry. And I know I was one of them until I really started focusing on grief. I'm sure I said all of those not so helpful things, and it's just human, but that's so important. So I do thank you for interviewing me to draw attention to this. And there is some grief involved in magical midlife, even if there's not a death. It's so important that you're bringing attention to all of this. I thank you, Lindsay, for including me.
Thank you so much. Okay, so if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, please share this with your friends, please comment on social media, because the more organic feedback we can get, and also actually if there's other people you want interviewed or other topics that you want to know about, please post that on Facebook, which is where we normally are. And my Facebook is Soulful Adventure. Lindsay de Swart also, lindsay.swart.ca. You will find me there. So, okay.
I cannot wait to attend one of your retreats. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I so look forward to it. When we can, we will be out there all having soulful adventures together, and it's going to be fun.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, Joanne.